A stallion had thrown every rider that day, 8 white champions in the dirt. Then a black beggar in canvas boots stepped up to the fence. The billionaire saw him and grabbed the microphone.
Get your black ass off my fence. This ain't your kind of arena.
Trent Holloway was laughing. 2,000 people heard him. The old man lowered his head.
Yes, sir. I'll step away.
Step away?
Trent sneered.
Boy, I'm offering $1.5 million to anyone who can ride that horse. And some beggar in rags thinks he's invited?
I didn't mean any trouble, sir.
Then go back to your crossroads, old man, where people like you belong.
The black beggar did not go back. He stepped forward, onto the clay, and reached for the reins of the horse that had thrown every rider. By sundown, he would win the $1.5 million. Subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from. Let me take you back to dawn. Holloway Ranch sits on 40,000 acres outside Fredericksburg, Texas. The arena was built to look like a Roman ring, if the Romans had favored white cedar fencing and imported bleachers shipped in from Kentucky. The ring had room for 2,000 ticketed spectators, 3 network cameras, and a podium tall enough that Trent Holloway could look down at every single person in it while he spoke. Trent Holloway was 38 years old, third-generation oil money, the kind of host who called reporters by their first name and ranch hands by, "Hey you." He had inherited the land, the oil leases, the stallion, and nothing resembling his grandfather's character. His grandfather had drilled wells and tipped well and kept his hat off indoors. Trent kept his hat on everywhere, including at supper. The event was called The Unbreakable. For 5 years running, Trent had flown in champion riders from across North America to try to last 8 seconds on a black Mustang stallion named Obsidian. The horse had been pulled from a bad auction 3 years earlier. His withers were crossed with the scars of a twisted wire bit that somebody had used on him when he was still a yearling. Nobody had ridden him to completion since he arrived at the ranch. Some men had quit horses altogether after their rides. One had quit with his jaw wired shut and his spine in a brace. This year, Trent had announced 8 challengers. 2 rodeo champs out of Calgary, an Olympic dressage rider from Kentucky, a Hollywood stuntman whose insurance agent had begged him in writing to decline, a Spanish Doma Vaquera specialist, a Montana Mustang tamer, a retired Marine with a reputation for breaking horses with his knees, a barrel racer from Oklahoma who had never lost a purse over $15,000. Every single one of them was white. You could have printed the program on ivory paper and nobody would have noticed the difference. The crowd that afternoon was 2,000 strong. A senator in a white hat, 3 oil executives with their wives beside them, network cameras on the north rail, reporters, half of them polite, half of them hungry, a row of sponsors in matching embroidered jackets, and at the fence in shadow stood a 52-year-old black man in canvas boots. His skin was the color of old walnut. His hands were steady as stone. His name was Raymond Anderson, and for 6 years of his life, he had been what the county quietly called the man at the crossroads. On Highway 16, at the intersection just outside the feed store, there was a patch of gravel where the shoulder widened into a small turnout. For 6 years, Raymond had stood on that patch with a cardboard sign that read, "Work for food. Any work." Some mornings he slept in a lean-to behind the feed store. Some mornings he slept under the concrete bridge at the county line. He did not drink. He did not ask for words from anyone. Only help when help was offered. He stood where the light was best, so drivers could read the sign. A year ago, a 19-year-old ranch hand named Cal Williams had pulled his pickup into that same gravel patch with a flat tire and 10 minutes until his shift at Holloway Ranch. He had no jack, no spare wrench, and no one else to call. Raymond walked over from the corner of the lot with the cardboard sign still in his hand. He changed the tire in 4 minutes with a piece of 2x4 and Cal's own bumper. Cal, red-faced, tried to press a $20 bill into his palm. Raymond closed his hand around the bill and passed it back. "Pay it forward. That's the only interest rate I charge." Cal had brought him a biscuit every single dawn since. 3 weeks before the unbreakable, Raymond stopped showing up at the crossroads. Cal found him one morning behind the feed store, sitting on an overturned plastic crate, staring at a photograph in the local paper. The photo showed Obsidian, black as a wet stone, rearing against a white rider in a cloud of dust. Raymond had not said a word. He had folded the paper carefully, creased it twice, smoothed it with the flat of his hand, and pressed it into the inside pocket of his coat, right against his chest. He had been circling Obsidian's paddock at dawn ever since, never touching the rail, just standing, just watching. On the north rail of the arena, a freelance reporter named Marla Davis had clocked Raymond on the first morning he appeared. Marla had been laid off by the Austin American-Statesman the previous spring. She was black. She had grown up in East Texas. She had watched Obsidian refuse food from the stable hands 3 mornings in a row. And now, she was watching a man with steady hands watch that same horse from 30 feet away, every dawn, without moving. She wrote Raymond's name in her notebook before the first rider mounted. The air that afternoon smelled like limestone after rain. The cicadas were climbing in pitch. A country station was playing, tinny and distant, through the PA. Saddle leather creaked. Boot heels rang on packed clay. Cal was watching Raymond from the gate, and he was remembering something else. 6 months earlier, Cal had spent 3 weeks trying to approach a spooked colt at the ranch. He couldn't get within 20 feet of the animal. One evening, Raymond had walked past the paddock at sundown, stopped, and shown Cal the footwork. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Not 3 weeks. 3 minutes. Cal had been too proud to ask where he had learned it. Men who sleep under bridges don't always want to be asked where they learned things. Now Cal watched a stable hand try to feed Obsidian a carrot. The horse's teeth snapped the air. The stable hand stumbled back 3 steps, swearing. And then, not all at once, but slowly, the way a man turns his head toward a sound far off, Obsidian's left ear swiveled. It swiveled toward the shadow at the fence line. It swiveled toward Raymond Anderson. Raymond did not move. He did not make a sound. His right hand came up, slow, and pressed once over the inside of his coat, where the folded newspaper lay flat against his heart. Then he lowered his hand, and he waited for the bell. The bell rang at 1 in the afternoon. The first rider was a Calgary rodeo champion with 2 national titles and a belt buckle that caught the light off the bleachers. Trent Holloway introduced him by name, by title, and by sponsor. The crowd cheered. The gate opened. He lasted 11 seconds. Obsidian put him on his back against the east rail so hard the silver bell on his hat rang. The crowd cheered the effort. The champion walked back to the chute smiling like a man who had just been mugged in front of his mother. The second rider lasted 15 seconds. The third, 12. Both airborne, both walking. The crowd clapped. The crowd shifted in its seats. The Olympic dressage rider from Kentucky lasted the longest of anyone that afternoon, 21 seconds, and then he lifted his right hand high and deliberate and dismounted himself in the middle of the ring. He walked to the rail without looking at the judges or the crowd. Later, to a reporter, he would say that he had never felt a horse who wanted to be understood more than it wanted to win. The crowd went quiet for a moment when he said it. Then the crowd forgot what he had said because the next rider was already in the gate. The Spanish Doma Vaquera specialist lasted 8 seconds, barely, and only because he landed clean on his feet and bowed to the horse afterward. The Hollywood stuntman lasted 14. The Montana Mustang tamer lasted 4. Obsidian hit him with a full-body twist that set the bleachers screaming and emptied the man's cowboy hat into the west rail. The retired Marine went in angry. He wore a combat knife on his belt, and he rolled his shoulders like a man who had mistaken a horse for an opponent. Obsidian threw him into the steel of the east rail with enough force that you could hear it 3 sections back. Nobody cheered. An ambulance rolled in from behind the cattle pens. No siren, just tires on gravel, a door opening, a stretcher unfolding. The Marine was conscious. He would recover. But when they loaded him into the bay, his eyes were closed. The barrel racer from Oklahoma went last. She was the best athlete of the 8. She had warmed up on 3 of her own horses that morning, reading Obsidian's body from the chute with the eyes of a woman who had made her living reading horses. She lasted 9 seconds. She walked off the arena floor under her own power. She did not look at Trent Holloway as she passed his podium. She took her hat off at the gate, crossed the clay to the barn, and did not come back. 8 riders, 8 failures. 5 straight years without a buckle. Trent's PR man, Bradley Johnson, climbed onto the podium next to him and whispered something urgent into his ear. Trent's smile tightened by half a degree. The investors in the oil section of the bleachers had started to check their phones. The network cameras were still rolling, but the director had cut twice to the senator in the white hat, who was yawning into his wristwatch. Trent did what wealth has always done when its spectacle starts to die. He improvised. He raised the microphone. He raised his voice. He raised the stakes. $1.5 million to anyone in this crowd, anyone at all, who can last 8 seconds on my horse. He said it laughing, as if it were a joke, but he was scanning the bleachers as he said it. He was looking for a cocky ranch kid, a drunk in the cheap seats, a boy on a dare, anybody with a hand in the air who could give him his spectacle back. He did not find what he was looking for, because by the time Trent's laughter finished, Raymond Anderson was already walking toward the gate. No raised hand, no shouted answer, no announcement, just the sound of canvas boots on packed clay, steady as a clock. 2,000 heads turned in a slow wave. The first rows first, then the middle, then the back. Somebody said, "Oh." Somebody else said, "No." In the third row from the rail, a woman in a blue church dress leaned forward and gripped her husband's wrist so tight her knuckles went pale. Trent's laughter cut off a half-second after it should have. He saw the man in canvas boots coming. He saw the cardboard sign gone from the coat. He saw Cal Williams breaking for the tack room at a dead run for reasons Trent could not yet explain to himself. And Trent did what wealth does when it is surprised. He reached for the microphone. That was when he said the sentence that would, by sundown, cost him everything he thought he owned. "Get your black ass off my fence. This ain't your kind of arena." The hook had just landed inside the story, and Raymond Anderson did not stop walking. The words echoed off the metal bleachers and came back smaller, but not small enough. 2,000 people heard Trent Holloway say it into a live microphone. The network cameras heard it. The senator in the white hat heard it. Bradley Johnson, the PR man, heard it and visibly winced, turning his face a quarter-inch away from the podium the way a man turns his face from a smell. Mrs. Ellen Taylor, 61 years old, in a blue dress with small white flowers, heard it and did not move her hands from her lap. But her mouth tightened into a line so thin it could have cut the air between her and the podium. Marla Davis, on the north rail, stopped writing in her notebook. She raised her phone. She started recording. Raymond Anderson stopped 20 feet inside the gate. He did not approach the horse yet. He stood on the clay, facing the podium, his coat buttoned and his hands loose at his sides. He waited the way a man waits for weather. Trent recovered the way wealth recovers, by laughing first and deciding later whether the laugh was a mistake. "Well, look at this. Ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a volunteer." The word volunteer hung in the air a beat too long. "Friend, what do we call you?" Raymond answered with one word. "Anderson." Not sir, not Mr. Holloway. The missing word was louder than the one he had given. Trent's smile tightened at the corners. He turned toward the crowd with his arms spread wide like a preacher about to deliver news. Mr. Anderson. And isn't that a fine name? Says he'd like a piece of my horse. Boy, you sure you don't want to start with something a little gentler? I got a pony out back, might be more your speed. The word boy landed in the arena like a dropped wrench. A pocket of the crowd laughed. Another pocket, smaller, nearer the rail, did not. The woman in the blue church dress turned her head slowly toward her husband. He did not meet her eyes. He looked at his hands. She waited. She did not look away. Bradley Johnson climbed onto the podium and leaned into Trent's shoulder. He whispered for 6 seconds. His left hand, as he spoke, kept tapping 2 fingers against the podium's edge, a small, urgent rhythm that said, "This is a gift. Use it." Trent's eyes changed the way a man's eyes change when he has just been handed ammunition he did not know he had. He turned back to the microphone with a new voice on. "Now, folks, I'm told Mr. Anderson here is a gentleman some of you might recognize. Stands over by the feed store on Highway 16 with a little cardboard sign. Honest working man." He paused, timing it, letting the crowd fill in the rest for themselves. "Well, we admire an honest working man in Texas, don't we?" A cheer came up, uncertain, late, shaped wrong in the mouth. A few hands clapped. More did not. Marla's grip on her phone went tight enough to whiten her knuckles. Trent pressed. "Tell you what, Mr. Anderson, you don't even gotta ride him. Walk him 10 feet. I'll give you $50 cash right here in my pocket." He patted his belt. "Beats standing at the crossroads with a cardboard sign, don't it?" The laughter that followed was the loudest of the afternoon. It was also the ugliest. There was relief in it. The relief of people who had been uncomfortable and were now being given permission to laugh the discomfort away. There was shame in it, too, because some of the people laughing heard themselves and stopped mid-breath. 2,000 people laughed, or did not laugh, at a black man in canvas boots standing on clay. And the sound of their laughter would, in 3 weeks' time, be played back in a cable news segment and discussed on the floor of the state legislature. None of them knew that yet. The woman in the blue church dress stood up. Her name was Ellen Taylor. She had raised 3 children in Gillespie County. Her husband had farmed 600 acres of cattle land for 40 years. Her dress was blue with small white flowers, and it was the kind of dress a woman wears to funerals. She said, loud enough to carry to the podium, "Let the man ride, Trent. That's enough now." Her husband touched her elbow. She did not sit down. The woman next to her stood up too, then a third. 3 women standing in a row, in the 3rd row from the rail, in a crowd of 2,000. And suddenly, the silence from the non-laughing pocket had a shape, a presence, a refusal. Trent's smile froze. He had, in the last 40 seconds, lost control of the tone of his own arena. He did what a man does when his first 2 weapons fail. He reached for a 3rd. All right, easy, Mrs. Taylor." He held up his hands, placating. "We're all friends here. Let's let the man ride." He turned back to Raymond. He gestured toward the chute where his own stable hands had laid out a leather bridle with a polished steel curb bit. The bit gleamed in the afternoon sun. Trent had chosen that bit personally. He loved how it gleamed. But Cal Williams was already at Raymond's side. He was holding a hackamore. Not the curb bit. Not the bridle with the steel. A bitless hackamore. The leather was dark with age, soft from decades of use. Cal had run to the back of the storeroom the instant Raymond had walked into the arena because he had known, without being told, without a word exchanged, which piece of tack Raymond would choose. Trent saw the hackamore. He laughed out loud. "No bit. Son, that's not how we ride in Texas." The "we" did the work the microphone could not. Raymond spoke for the 2nd time that afternoon. 8 words, quietly, toward the podium. He did not raise his voice. "It's how the men who taught me rode." The arena quieted by a third. Trent stared at him for 2 full seconds. Then he covered the silence with a grin and a clipboard. He held up a waiver. "Suit yourself, Mr. Anderson. Sign this. If this horse breaks your neck, that's on you, not on me, not on Holloway Ranch, not on any Holloway who ever walked this land." He held out a pen. Raymond walked to the podium. He took the pen. He read the waiver, every line of it, the way a man who has signed away his life once before reads legal documents. He found the signature line. His hand did not shake. He signed James Raymond Anderson in a steady professional cursive that surprised 2 reporters in the front row. Trent glanced down at the signature. His face did something strange for a half-second. A flicker, a tightening around the eyes, as if the name James on the page meant something to him that he could not yet place. It was gone before anyone else caught it. Raymond handed the pen back. He did not look at Trent when he did it. He turned toward the horse. Cal fell in beside him for 3 steps, then dropped back. It was not his to do. Raymond walked alone across the clay toward Obsidian. The first row began to quiet, then the second, then the third, then the section. By the time Raymond stood 30 feet from the horse, 2,000 people were making less sound than a single flagpole rope slapping against steel in a breeze. From the north rail, Marla Davis lowered her phone. She was no longer recording. She knew, the way she had known 2 weeks ago when she wrote his name in her notebook, that what was about to happen was not a rodeo. It was a homecoming. Raymond stopped 30 feet from the horse. He stood there. He breathed. 5 full seconds passed. A man in the cheap seats, 3 sections up on the west side, yelled, "Get on with it, old man!" Loud, brittle, impatient, his voice pushed up the register by the discomfort of a silence he did not understand. Mrs. Ellen Taylor turned around in her row and said, without raising her voice, "You, be quiet." She did not smile when she said it. The man in the cheap seats did not speak again. Not that afternoon, not ever. At least, not while Ellen Taylor could see him. Raymond did not react to either of them. He kept breathing. Obsidian, who had charged every human being who approached him for 3 years, who had sent 8 champion riders into the dirt that afternoon alone, whose ribs were heaving from a kind of exhausted terror that no single rider had caused, did not charge. He stood at the far end of the arena. Sweat foamed on the black of his neck. His eyes rolled white at the edges. His nostrils flared and softened, working the way a horse's nostrils work when he is trying to smell a thing that does not fit his memory of the world. And then his left ear swiveled. It swiveled toward Raymond Anderson. Raymond took 3 slow steps forward, stopped, breathed, took 3 more, stopped again. The space between them was a language. The crowd was being taught that language in real time. You could feel it happening in the seats, the way a room of strangers will fall silent when somebody sits down at a piano and begins to play something they all recognize. Except no piano had been touched. A man in canvas boots had simply taken 6 steps and stopped twice, and 2,000 people were discovering, without being told, that they had been holding their breath. Obsidian's nostrils flared, then softened, then flared again. A shudder ran the length of his withers, right across the old scar where the twisted wire bit had sat on him when he was a colt. The horse was reading Raymond back, reading his posture, reading the speed of his breath, reading the weight on the balls of his feet, reading whether this was one more man who had come to break him. Raymond took 3 more steps, stopped. 3 more. At 10 feet, he did something the crowd did not yet understand. He did not look Obsidian in the eye. He looked at the horse's shoulder. Steady, patient, unthreatening. Horses read eye contact the way people read raised voices. Raymond was saving his eye contact. Nobody in the stands yet knew for whom. At 5 feet, he extended the back of his right hand. Not his palm, not a treat, not food. Just the back of his hand, knuckles toward the horse, fingers loose. Obsidian could have torn that hand off at the wrist. Obsidian had done worse to better men. The stallion lowered his head. The arena went silent. Not quiet. Silent. A baby somewhere in the north section cooed. A mother shushed it. Gently, almost apologetically. 2,000 people were trying not to breathe at the same time. A man in a white hat took that hat off and pressed it against his chest. He did not know he was doing it. His wife, next to him, had both her hands over her mouth. And then, very slowly, Raymond touched the horse. He did not touch his face. He did not reach for the mane. He laid his palm, flat and warm, on Obsidian's shoulder, directly over the old scar from the twisted wire bit. His lips moved. No microphone caught what he said, but Marla Davis was 30 feet away, and she would swear later, into a hay-smelling notebook at midnight, that his lips shaped 4 words. I know. It wasn't you. Obsidian leaned his weight just slightly into Raymond's hand. Raymond lifted the hackamore from where Cal had slung it across his shoulder. He let the horse smell the leather first. He let Obsidian touch the worn bozal with his nose, the way a man lets a dog approve of a new collar. Then he slid the hackamore on, not over, not around, but through the trust that had just opened between them. The leather settled. Obsidian did not pull back. Raymond spoke then, for the 3rd time that afternoon, not to the horse, not to Trent, just loud enough for the first 4 rows of the bleachers to hear him. My grandfather rode the Chisholm Trail. His father rode it before him. He paused, looking down at the knot of the hackamore in his hands. 1 in 4 cowboys on that trail looked like me. Another pause. You won't read that in the program tonight. A reporter in the front row, a young man from the Houston Chronicle, lowered his phone. Another reporter, older, from a cable news affiliate, raised his. Marla Davis was already crying. She didn't know she was crying. The tears just moved down her face while her hands kept her own recorder steady. Raymond gathered the reins. He did not vault into the saddle. He did not swing. He did not hop. He lifted his left foot into the stirrup, slow as sunrise, and he stepped up. He sat down in the saddle the way a man sits down in a chair he owns. Obsidian took 1 small step sideways, tested the weight, settled beneath him. The crowd did not cheer. The crowd could not. The crowd had forgotten the mechanism of cheering. Raymond asked the horse to walk. Obsidian walked. A trot. Obsidian trotted with a rhythm so even a metronome could have worked to it. The ambulance driver, parked behind the cattle pens, lowered his newspaper and leaned forward against the steering wheel. A canter. At the far end of the arena, beyond Trent's podium, where the clay was firmer and the dust would settle cleanest, Obsidian cantered. The dust barely lifted from his hooves. You could have set a teacup on his back and not spilled a drop. 4 minutes in, Raymond asked the horse to do something no rider in 5 years had ever asked Obsidian to do. He asked for a lead change. Obsidian gave it to him, clean. Raymond asked again, this time the other direction. Obsidian changed leads, clean. A murmur moved through the bleachers, not a cheer, a murmur. The way a congregation murmurs when a preacher says something that sounds like scripture they have never heard before. Raymond turned the horse toward the podium. He rode him at a slow canter down the dead center line of the arena. He asked, through nothing but a shift of weight and a tightening of one hand, for a sliding stop. Obsidian gave it to him. At the dead center of the ring, 20 feet from the base of the podium where Trent Holloway stood with the microphone going dead in his hand. Dust rose. The hooves hissed into the clay. The stallion planted like he had been carved from stone. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. No buck. Not one. Not a single skip of a rein, a flinch of an ear, a shift of resistance. The arena held its breath for one more beat because, Nobody yet knew what to do with what they had just seen. A reporter in the front row, the young man from the Houston Chronicle, leaned forward so hard that his press badge swung forward and tapped the rail. He whispered, to nobody in particular, a word that was not fit for his editor's column, but which described accurately the shape of his disbelief. Marla Davis closed her notebook. She had stopped writing 2 minutes ago. Some things she had decided she would write down later, after her hands had stopped shaking. Up on the podium, Trent Holloway was holding a microphone he had forgotten to speak into. The senator in the white hat had turned very slowly to look at him. The 3 oil executives in the front row were no longer checking their phones. One of them was crying. He would later claim to his wife and his barber that it was the dust. Cal Williams stood at the gate with his hands on the top rail. He was smiling. He had not smiled since his mother's funeral 6 years earlier. And at the dead center line of the arena, Raymond Anderson sat on a black stallion in perfect stillness. The horse's ears were forward. The horse's breath was slow. The horse was waiting for the next ask. There would not be another ask, because Raymond Anderson was about to dismount, and what came next would make the photograph that ran the following morning on the front page of every major newspaper west of the Mississippi. Raymond dismounted at the dead center line of the arena. He did not walk Obsidian to the rail. He did not hand him off to a stable hand. He stepped down from the saddle, let the reins fall loose across the stallion's neck, and stood there. Obsidian did not move. For the first time that afternoon, Raymond Anderson's face was fully visible to the 2,000 people sitting in the bleachers. He was 52 years old. His jaw was set. His mouth was neither soft nor hard, and he was looking up, past the clay, past the fence, past the flowers on Ellen Taylor's blue church dress, directly at Trent Holloway. He gave Trent the eye contact he had refused to give the horse. The arena did not applaud. It did not know yet that it was allowed to. The silence went on for 4 seconds, then 5. Somewhere near the gate, a hinge creaked. Somewhere in the 3rd row from the rail, a little girl whispered to her mother, "Is it over?" Her mother did not answer. Her mother was crying. And then Mrs. Ellen Taylor stood up in her row. She put her hands together, and she clapped. Once. Just once. The sound of that single clap carried up the bleachers like a struck bell. A cattle farmer in a green work shirt 2 rows behind her clapped next. Then a young woman to Marla's left at the rail. Her name was Denise. She was 24, and she would later name her first daughter after Ellen Taylor without ever having met the woman. Then a senator's aide, without glancing at the senator. Then a cluster of reporters. Then a whole section. Then every section. The noise climbed the bleachers the way fire climbs a wheat field. By the time it reached the back row, it was no longer clapping. It was a roar. 2,000 voices at once put physical pressure on the chest of every person in that arena. The network cameras picked it up on the overhead mics, and the director in the broadcast truck leaned forward and said quietly to his co-producer, "Don't cut. Don't cut. Don't cut." Trent Holloway stood on his podium with the microphone in his right hand. He did not move it to his mouth. He did not smile. He did not wave. The microphone had become a brick. On the clay, Raymond Anderson turned slightly. He reached out his right hand without looking. Cal Williams stepped up from the gate and placed the hackamore into Raymond's palm, then backed off a half step. Raymond did not hand the hackamore to one of Trent's stable hands. He handed it back to Cal. Then he spoke, once, loud enough for the first 12 rows to hear him clearly over the tail of the applause. A horse remembers kindness longer than any whip. The roar spiked, then quieted, because 2,000 people understood almost at once that he had more to say. Raymond turned finally so that his whole body faced the podium. He lifted his chin toward Trent. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When a crowd of 2,000 is trying to hear a single man speak, he can whisper and be heard in the cheap seats. You said, "I stand at the crossroads." The arena went quiet. That's true. He let the word hang. A lot of good men have stood at crossroads. Some of them were waiting for a ride that never came. Ellen Taylor covered her mouth with her hand. I wasn't waiting. Raymond looked up at Trent, directly, without apology. I was choosing. The hinge near the gate creaked plainly in the silence that followed. A red-tailed hawk circling somewhere beyond the arena roof cried once and moved on. Then the arena detonated again. Trent Holloway stood on his podium with his mouth slightly open. He was 38 years old. He had been educated at a private school in Dallas that cost more per year than the average Texan earned in 5. He had given a commencement speech there 2 months earlier. He had told the graduating class that courage was the most important virtue a man could possess. He could not, at this moment, open his mouth and speak. The senator in the white hat had turned very deliberately to study him. The network cameras were still rolling. The oil executives were no longer checking their phones. Bradley Johnson, the PR man, had both hands in his pockets and was staring straight down at his polished boots. Trent was cornered on his own stage. He did what wealth does when it has no other door. He honored the bet. He set the microphone down on the podium, carefully, like a man setting down a hot pan. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket for the checkbook his lawyer had told him 3 years ago to stop carrying, and which his grandfather had told him 40 years ago never to be without. He uncapped a pen. His hand was not quite steady. He wrote the date. He wrote the amount. He wrote Raymond Anderson on the pay-to line in a handwriting that had, a moment earlier, been famous in 3 counties for its elegant slant. The signature came out wrong. He had to re-sign it. He signed it in front of the network cameras because every other door had closed. He tore the check out along the perforation. The sound of that tear was audible in the front row. He held the check over the edge of the podium for Raymond to take. And that was the moment Obsidian walked over. The horse had not been held. The reins had been lying loose on his neck for almost 3 minutes. Nobody had called him. Nobody had signaled him. And now, unprompted, he took 6 slow, deliberate steps across the clay and came to rest at Raymond Anderson's right shoulder. He lowered his head. He leaned it, just slightly, against Raymond's upper arm. Trent Holloway's hand, holding out the check, went very still. That image, a black man in canvas boots with a cardboard sign still folded in his coat, standing shoulder to shoulder with a black stallion that had chosen him over the man who had paid for everything, was the photograph that would run on the front page of every major newspaper in Texas the following morning. By the end of the week, it would run in half the newspapers in America. The Texas Monthly piece that Marla Davis had already begun writing in her head, even as she watched, would use a cropped version of that photograph on its cover 3 months later. Raymond reached up and took the check from Trent's hand. He did not look at it. He folded it in half without reading the amount and slid it into the inside breast pocket of his coat. The same pocket, against the same chest, where the folded 3-week-old newspaper with Obsidian's photograph still lay flat. Somewhere in the front row of reporters, a young man found his voice. "Mr. Anderson, who are you?" Raymond did not answer. He placed his hand on Obsidian's neck over the place where the mane lay thickest, and he stood there with the horse as the roar of the crowd rolled on and on. Off to the side of the arena at the north rail, Marla Davis lowered her phone. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. She had been reading her own notebook for 3 weeks. She already knew who he was, and she was about to be the reporter who told the rest of the country. The reporters swarmed. They moved fast, and they were not kind with microphones. One asked Raymond how it felt to be rich. Another asked him if he had known the horse before that afternoon. A third, a young man in a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, asked him why he had been sleeping under a bridge if he could ride like that. Raymond answered only that last question. He answered it politely. He answered it briefly. A man's worth isn't measured by his boots. Then he turned away from the microphones. He walked through the thicket of arms and phones and shouted questions toward Cal Williams at the fence. He asked Cal, quietly, for his coat back. Cal had folded it over the top rail an hour earlier during the exchange with Trent. Marla Davis had been waiting. She sat on a hay bale 20 feet beyond the reporter scrum. She was not part of it. When Raymond walked past, she did not raise a microphone. She did not stand up. She just said gently, "Would you sit down, Mr. Anderson? I have one question." Raymond sat. Marla set her phone on the hay bale between them. She let it record without touching it. She said, "Who were you before the crossroads?" Raymond looked at her for a long moment, at her notebook, at her tired eyes, at the laminated press badge that read Austin American Statesman in letters that had been crossed out and replaced with freelance in ballpoint pen. "My mother called me James." Marla wrote that down. 22 years ago, he said, I was the head trainer at Bluegrass Ridge Stables in Lexington, Kentucky. I was 30 years old. I was the first black head trainer that barn had in 140 years of continuous operation. I trained 2 stakes winners before my 31st birthday. What happened? A highway happened. A rain-slick road on a Thursday night. I should have been home an hour earlier. My wife was driving because I was tired. My daughter was 6 years old. I was in the passenger seat. I walked away with a broken collarbone. They didn't walk away at all. Marla did not interrupt. When I came back to work 6 months later, the owners had restructured. My position had been eliminated. The young man who had been my assistant was sitting in my office. He had half my record. The papers didn't ask questions about it. I didn't ask questions either. I left the Bluegrass. I kept walking. For 16 years, I worked kitchens. I worked loading docks. I drank, briefly. Then I stopped. He paused. When my body couldn't lift a saddle anymore, I couldn't work a ranch. And when you can't work a ranch in the hill country, you become a man at a crossroads with a cardboard sign. Another pause. I stood where the light was best, so drivers could read the sign. Marla said very quietly, "Was that shameful?" The crossroads isn't shameful. It's just honest. He looked out across the arena where the network cameras were being broken down for the evening. The shame was in the people who drove past and pretended not to see me. Marla wrote that down too. She underlined it twice. "Why Obsidian?" she asked. Raymond allowed himself, for the first time that afternoon, the smallest smile. I knew the sire. I trained the sire's dam 24 years ago in Kentucky. When I saw the photograph in the local paper 3 weeks ago, I recognized the bloodline. I recognized the shape of the scars on his withers, the shape of a twisted wire bit on a yearling. I recognized the cruelty. I stayed to see if the horse still had anything left in him. He looked at his hands. I think he was asking the same about me. Marla's phone kept recording. Across the arena, Trent Holloway was trying to feed a quote to a second-tier reporter about generosity and opportunity in the spirit of the Holloway family. The reporter nodded, thanked him, closed his notebook, and walked away without writing anything down. The story had already left Trent behind. Cal came over with Raymond's coat folded carefully. The biscuit Cal had slipped into the inside pocket at dawn was still there, untouched. Marla saw, as Raymond unfolded the coat, the old newspaper pressed flat against the lining. Obsidian's photograph. 3 weeks soft, creased by 3 weeks of his heartbeat. Raymond put on the coat. He walked alone to Obsidian's stall. It was past 9 in the evening. The arena floodlights had dimmed to the security bulbs. The concrete of the aisle was cool against his boots. Moths had found the overhead lamps. From somewhere far off, a dog was barking at a coyote it could not see. Raymond stopped at the half door of the stall.
Obsidian came over on his own. He put his head over the door and rested it, gentle, against Raymond's chest, against the place where the folded newspaper had been pressed for 3 weeks. Raymond's hand came up to cup the side of the stallion's face. "Easy, brother," he said. "We're all right now." 6 months later, 80 acres of leased pasture on the southern edge of the Texas hill country. A gate made of cedar. A sign above the gate burned into the wood by a 19-year-old named Cal Williams with a soldering iron and a steady hand. Anderson Ranch and Rescue. Below it, smaller, a second line. Chisholm Apprenticeship, EST 2026. All hands welcome. Most of the $1.5 million was in a trust now. The trust had 2 jobs. The first was to rehabilitate abused horses. Mustangs, auction rescues, private sale wrecks from barns that should have known better. The second was to run a free apprenticeship for young black and brown riders who had been priced out of English and Western stables their entire lives. The apprenticeship had been named after the Chisholm Trail, after the trail Raymond Anderson's grandfather had ridden, and his great-grandfather before him. With the 1 in 4 cowboys who would not appear in any program any of them would ever read. Cal Williams was the first employee. He ran the tack room and the apprentice intake. He had left Halloway Ranch the morning after the Unbreakable. Trent had not tried to stop him. Mala Davis's long-form feature in Texas Monthly, titled The Man at the Crossroads, had run that spring. It brought 40 volunteer applications to Anderson Ranch in the first week. It was reprinted, in part, in 4 national outlets. Marla had been hired back by the Austin American-Statesman as a senior features writer 2 weeks after the issue hit newsstands. She had accepted the job with 2 conditions in writing. The paper had agreed to both. Obsidian was there, of course. Trent Halloway had discovered 2 weeks after The Unbreakable that he could not stomach the public relations storm of keeping a black stallion that had chosen a black stranger on his own arena floor. He had sold Obsidian to Anderson Ranch and Rescue for $1. That $1 bill was now framed on the wall of the barn office, below a small hand-lettered caption that read simply, "Receipt." Trent Halloway was mentioned, one final time that spring, by a reporter doing a sidebar in the Austin American-Statesman. The reporter noted that The Unbreakable had been quietly canceled for the following year. His name was said once, and the article moved on. That, in the end, was worse for him than any speech Raymond could have made. On Highway 16, at the intersection just outside the feed store, there's now a small hand-painted wooden sign. It was made by Cal Williams on a Saturday morning. Scrap cedar, white latex house paint, a steady hand. It reads, "If you need work, go 3 miles west. The Anderson Ranch is hiring." R.A. Raymond has never said anything about the sign. He pretends not to know it's there. Cal pretends not to know he pretends. On a Tuesday evening in the 6th month of the ranch's operation, in the far round pen of Anderson Ranch and Rescue, a young black woman named Monica Brooks stood 30 feet from a skittish bay mare. Monica was 26 years old. She had come home from a deployment overseas with a tremor in her hands that no doctor had been able to name. She had not been able to hold a coffee cup steady in 19 months. She had driven 3 hours that morning, alone, to meet the man the Texas Monthly piece had called a trainer of horses, and apparently of people, too. Raymond stood a half step behind her. He said, low, so only she could hear, "I know. It wasn't you." Monica's shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. The mare lifted her head. Her nostrils flared, then softened. The mare lowered her head. Monica breathed. Really breathed. The kind of breath that reaches the bottom of the lungs, for the first time, she would later say, since she had come home. The sun was going down over the hill country. In the far pasture, a black stallion was grazing free, unsaddled, unbridled. The last light caught on the old scars along his withers and made them briefly almost beautiful. At the fence, a man with steady hands leaned against the top rail and watched. He did not speak. He did not need to. The broken don't fear the unbreakable. They recognize it. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who has been told they didn't belong in the room. And drive carefully the next time you pass a man at a crossroads. He may already be choosing.
Before we end this video, I want to tell you something. The first time I read Raymond Anderson's story, I had to put the paper down. I sat in my kitchen for about 20 minutes and just looked at the wall because I kept thinking about one thing. For 6 years he stood at that crossroads and cars rolled by. Thousands of them, people he probably recognized, people who probably recognized him, and nobody stopped. But he was never the one who was broken. You know who was? The man on the podium. The man with 40,000 ads. The man who needed a microphone to feel tall. Raymond was never begging. He was waiting for the right horse. So, here's what I want to argue tonight. Who are you driving past every morning? That guy at the gas station? Who the woman who cleans your office? The old man at the crossroad with a cardboard sign? You don't know what they used to be. You don't know what they still are. Somebody in your life right now is Raymond Anderson, and nobody has bothered to look twice. If this story moved you, do one thing for me. Tomorrow, look somebody in the eye who isn't used to being looked at. Just that. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. Share this with someone who was told they didn't belong in the room. Because sometimes the broken horse isn't the horse, it's the man who thought he owned him. Good night.